My name is Zeyna. I'm a professor of practice at the School of Journalism, and I'm going to be introducing Matthew VanDyke and then my colleague Mort Rosenblum afterwards. So first I'm going to introduce Matthew, and he's going to speak a little bit about his work as a filmmaker, and actually he has a long list of jobs. It kind of reminds me of my early years. But, and then afterwards he's going to show us his film, Not Anymore, A Story of Revolution. His film, mostly filmed in Aleppo in Syria. But he's the filmmaker behind this. He graduated from Georgetown's Security Studies program. I used to work at CCAS right before you, I think. He graduated in 2004 and set out in 2007 on a motorcycle trip that would eventually lead to Afghanistan, so I hope we hear more about that. He has worked as a soldier, war correspondent, political columnist, talk show host, English teacher, international businessman, field producer for the Wartime War Zone Bikers Project, and a documentary filmmaker. Besides the film, today we'll see the film he's done, Not Anymore, A Story of Revolution, but also something he's working on, Run and Gun. We'll hear a bit about his experiences fighting with the Libyan uprising, for which he was awarded the Shield of Courage by the head of the Ali Hassan al-Jaber Brigade, and an Embassy of Libya Award for support, commitment, and outstanding dedication to the Libyan Revolution. He's been labeled as a terrorist by the regime of Bashar al-Assad, which is probably a pretty good position to be in, and largely because he has sworn to help overthrow the regime of Bashar al-Assad. So Matthew, thank you for joining us. We look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.
Thank you for the nice introduction. It's nice to be in Tucson. It's much better than New York weather. And thank you for having me to come speak to you today about the Syrian revolution. And my perspective on Syria and my involvement in it is a bit unconventional. So I like to give a little bit of background about how I got to be here today. In 2004, I graduated from the Security Studies program at Georgetown University with a master's degree. And my concentration was in the Middle East. A lot of my classmates went on to work for the CIA and the FBI and the Department of Defense. And I almost did the same thing. I had an offer of employment from the CIA my first semester at Georgetown. I'd come out of undergrad with a very strong academic record. I'd graduated summa cum laude, and they came after me first semester, offered me a summer position. But there were reschedulings of polygraphs and things that led them to say apply again the next year. But then the Iraq War started, and I didn't agree with it. And I didn't want to be assigned to work on that issue. So I became involved in the anti-war movement. So having graduated and no longer wanting to work for the US government, I decided to set out on a motorcycle and see the region for myself. So from 2007 to 2010, I basically traveled from Mauritania in West Africa all the way to Iraq, and then onward to Iran and Afghanistan. And I was living with people I met, sleeping in a tent in the desert, staying in $4 hotels. It was a very difficult time. I did not have much money. I made some money as I went, but during this time, one of the countries I went to was Libya. And at that time, it was very difficult for Americans to get a visa to enter Libya. So I had to pay a lot of money for a bribe that got me a VIP business visa that said that I worked for a company I never heard of. And it worked, and I was in Libya for about a month and a half in Tripoli. And then eventually the regime got irritated at me and gave me 48 hours to leave. But during that time, that month and a half, I made some of the best friends that I have to this day, Libyans. And so 3 years later, I found when the revolution started, I was talking to these friends online. And they were telling me about family, friends, neighbors who were being killed by the regime in the early days of the revolution, at that first week, how they were going out in the street and protesting, for their freedom, throwing rocks and being met with gunfire. And one of them said to me when things were looking really dim, will you tell your friends about me if I die? And then a few days later, he said, essentially, why doesn't anybody help us? And at that time, it looked like NATO was not going to get involved in the war. This was within the first week of the revolution. So I thought about it really didn't take that long, a few minutes, and I realized, that's right, why doesn't anybody help? So I decided that I couldn't just sit at home on my sofa and watch on TV something happen to people that I knew personally, that I cared about. And during all my travels, Libya was always the country that I felt most connected to and that I had the best friends there. So I decided that day that I would go and support the revolution in whatever way I could. And so I called my mother and told her, and she said that if she was my age, she'd be doing the exact same thing. I called my girlfriend and told her that she should come home from work early, and she was not as supportive about it. But you know, we went to the airport, and we missed the flight because of traffic, so we went and did it again the next day. But that was in late February, and I went to Cairo, and then I managed to arrange transportation into Libya. So I arrived in Libya in early March. Now, the early days of the Libyan revolution, without the outside support, it was sort of like a Mad Max movie. So what you would do is I arrived, and I had called my friend Nori, who you'll see in some of these photos. It's Nori there driving the Jeep in that picture. I had met Nori in Mauritania in 2007. And at that time, Nori was a hippie. And he had been traveling around the world for peace and love. And he had been in a few press articles. And I thought I would get there and Nori would still be a hippie. Well, I got there and Nori was in a military uniform, completely serious. And from that moment, I was in the revolution. That very day, we went and fixed up the truck that I would later be captured in. And Nori had a military uniform for me. I just didn't speak much, and people thought I was Libyan. I was able to go in and out of military bases like any other fighter in the revolution. And we worked very hard. We had a Toyota Helix pickup truck. We went into the military base. We got ammunition, weapons, RPG, a Dushka heavy machine gun. Did some welding work. We did some welding work on the truck, mounted the heavy machine gun, and we were ready to go to the front line. So Nori had to work at a military base. He had been volunteering, so he was doing that, and I went with other men in our group and our unit to the town of Brega to do reconnaissance because Gaddafi had just captured Ras Lanuf, and the next town that was going to be the front line was Brega. So we went to do recon to decide where to set up a mortar that we had found a mortar stamped 1942, made in USA, that we were going to use, and our Dushka and our RPG. So we went to do recon, and I was captured. Our vehicle was captured during that mission. To this day, I still don't know exactly what happened. I was hit in the head. I basically woke up in prison to the sound of a man being tortured in the cell above me, with a scar under my hair. They told me that they had covered my eyes up. They said if I took it off, they would kill me. I was interrogated, accused of being CIA or Mossad, told that I would never see America again, shipped off to Tripoli, where I spent the next about 6 months in two of Libya's most notorious prisons, Maktab al-Nasr prison and later Abu Salim prison. These prisons were the first prison was 3 or 4 feet by 7 feet with a small hole in the ceiling for light. I wasn't told exactly what I was accused of, if I would ever be released. The Libyan government told the world that they didn't know what happened to me. My family, everybody thought I was dead until the very last few weeks, when the Libyan government finally admitted they had me but wouldn't let anybody talk to me. And that was my existence for about 6 months, and occasionally hearing men being tortured in other parts of the prison, not knowing if I would ever be released or what was going to happen to me. And then one day, there was a lot of noise outside the prison, and prisoners came to my cell, broke the lock off, and we escaped from a Muslim prison. And that was the first time that I learned that NATO had become involved in the war about a week after I'd been captured. That was the first time I learned there was a Syrian revolution. I saw these things on TV. When I was in prison and I heard anti-aircraft fire, I thought it had been celebratory gunfire. When I heard booms from the bombings, I thought it was Gaddafi's jets breaking the sound barrier to rally people. Because none of it fit. I never imagined that NATO would become involved in the war at the time that I was captured. So I waited in Tripoli for Nori to come from Benghazi, and then we went right back to the front line. And by this time, the rebels were more organized. They had formed the National Liberation Army. I went to a commander, and I said I'd like to join. So I had a lot of street cred after being in two of the worst prisons. So they issued me a Libyan military ID. They gave me command of a Jeep. Nori and I went and got a Dushka from Nori's brother. We mounted it on the Jeep. I became a Dushka heavy machine gunner. Nori was the driver. So I was serving in the war with my Libyan friend that I had known for 4 years at that point. And we fought mostly in Sirte. We had about 40 engagements with the enemy. And then after the war, about 2 weeks after Gaddafi was killed and the war was over, I came back to America. And then I turned my attention to Syria, like a lot of veterans of the Libyan revolution had done. And some went to fight, and I wanted to go with them to fight. But as I read the reports coming out of Syria, I found that a lot of rebels were sitting in Turkey without weapons or ammunition. So they didn't need another man at the front line. The situation was quite different than the Libyan revolution, where at the time that I went to fight, before NATO involvement, there were very few rebels going to the front line. A lot of people thought it was hopeless, and they sat in Benghazi waiting to be wiped out. And then even after I escaped prison, a lot of people had stopped fighting after the fall of Tripoli because nobody wanted to be the last man to die in a war. So in both of those situations, it made sense for me to go to the front line and fight because they needed every man up there. But in Syria, the supply shortage was the biggest problem. So I decided to make the film that you'll see with the goal of encouraging international support for the revolution, whether through private donations or moving public opinion in countries so that the governments will support the revolution. So now I've dedicated myself to these revolutions because I believe in liberty. And that's really as simple as that. In Libya, it was very personal to me because of my friends. But I was transformed by my experience in Libya and seeing the effect of what we achieved to where I really became strongly ideological. And I believe that people all around the world in the 21st century, you know, we've put a man on the moon in the late 60s. Yet we still have people around the world today living under medieval forms of government. And I think it makes absolutely no sense that we've abandoned all these people, hundreds of millions of people, to live under authoritarianism. So I think it's a moral imperative that we bring them in the 21st century. There's people waiting in prisons. There's people waiting on front lines. There's old men who are waiting in their homes. They just want to know before they die that their children and grandchildren won't suffer the same fate of living their entire lives under authoritarianism. And they're not just waiting in Syria, they're waiting in Iran, they're waiting in North Korea, they're waiting all over the world. It's a problem that transcends national boundaries and continents. And I believe that we're at a pivotal moment in history. Just as civilization started in the Middle East, I think that we're in a wave of revolutions that is going to eventually lead to the fall of authoritarianism around the world. And hopefully in my lifetime, I'll be ashamed of what we've accomplished in this generation if my grandchildren grow up in a world where they know of authoritarianism from anything other than history books. And this is why Syria is so important, because the regimes are like dominoes and they're falling. And Syria is the next domino to fall. And after Syria, hopefully Iran. And after Iran, who knows? Hopefully it'll leap to Africa or Asia. And this is why Libya was important, because we showed that armed revolution, as it had been in parts of Europe and the United States, was a path to liberation, and one of the few paths. These regimes will not fall because you ask them to. They won't fall because of peaceful protests. In Tunisia, yes, that worked. In Egypt, apparently it hasn't. Normally they have to be kicked out. And this is what I've dedicated myself to doing whatever I can, whether it's fighting on the front line or whether it's making a film to try to increase international support. Whatever need there is, I'll use whatever method I can think of to try to do something about it. I believe in proactive activism, not just sitting on your sofa and tacitly supporting something that you're watching. And some people disagree with that, and that's fine. They're free to do that. What about the Syrian revolution? Now, there's a lot of complications in the Syrian revolution, and a lot of people are critical of it. And there are people in Syria who are fighting for other interests. But as long as they shoot in the right direction at Assad's forces, I really don't care. The fact is that Assad is currently winning. If I can get the mic a little higher. Yeah. There we go. Okay. The Assad regime is currently winning the revolution in Syria. And the peace talks that are currently ongoing will produce absolutely nothing. These are things that the international community does to feel good about themselves so that they can say that they did something and pat themselves on the back. But at the end of the day, it might even be detrimental to the cause of the revolution, these talks. The fact is that without a lot more international support, the revolution will not succeed. And there's a chance that what gains have been made for a region that's free in Syria could be lost. And the world needs the support of the international community. So if people here want to help the Syrian revolution, public outreach is what I believe needs to be done more than anything. This president is not going to do anything for Syria, but the next president might. And the poll numbers in the United States and Europe need to come up for support for intervention in Syria. So that is the way that I believe that each of you, including college students, can make a difference if you want to make this your cause. So in conclusion, yes, the revolution can still succeed. It's not going to be quick. It's going to take several years. And I hope all of you will support it. Thank you.